So today is the next installment of Richard Iron's acclaimed In Conversation series. To discuss the topic of ending war, lessons from Somaliland, we're joined by Dr. Sarah Phillips. Sarah is Associate Professor of International Security and Development at the University of Sydney. She focuses on international intervention in the Global South, on state building, on non-state governance. And to do that, she's carried out extensive field work on the Arabian Peninsula and in the Horn of Africa. She's very widely published. She's written 3 books. And her latest, which has just been published and which we'll discuss today, is When There Was No Aid, War and Peace in Somaliland. Now, the publishers have kindly agreed that everyone who's registered today gets a 30% discount. There's a flyer here that explains all the details, and we'll attach that when we send out the link to the recording in a couple of days' time. So you'll all be able to buy the book. Richard Iron is well known to most of you, both from his role as a council member of AAA Victoria, and obviously from previous installments of his conversations with a range of interesting people. Prior to that, he was with the British Army for 37 years and based all around the world. He was a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford in the Changing Character of War program, and he was the lead editor of a book called British Generals in Blair's Wars. Anyway, thank you both very much for joining us, and I'll hand across to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, most of our conversation this evening will be exploring why Somaliland has managed to find and sustain peace when the rest of Somalia clearly hasn't. And I'll then ask you what we can learn, if anything, for some of the world's other seemingly intractable conflicts. But first, I think we need a bit of background about Somalia and Somaliland, both history and geography. So can we start there?
Sure. Thanks very much, Richard and Alistair, for hosting me today. Just bear with me. It's put you into... There we go. Sorry about that. Little Zoom issues. Yeah, thank you very much for hosting me. I'm really pleased to be here and to see so much interest in this topic. So as you can see from the map here, Somalia really forms this sort of 7-shaped part of East Africa. It butts up against the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, and it sits right across from Yemen. And Somaliland is the section that is up in the northwestern corner. Now, Somaliland was more peripheral to the British Empire than the rest of Somalia was to the Italian Empire. So from Puntland down to the south had been colonized by the Italians. The Italians were, by all accounts, more brutal in their destruction of local governance structures, which is not to say that the British were not violent and self-serving, just that they ran the protectorate of Somaliland at a bit more of a distance than the Italians did, because their main interest in holding territory in Somaliland was in supplying livestock and meat to Aden just across the Red Sea, which was used to supply the colony in India. Now, Somaliland, as I'm sure some of you probably know, has never been recognized as a sovereign entity by any other state in the international community. Now, they did hold independence for 5 days back in 1960, and this 5 days has reached, I would say, almost mythical status. When you're in Somaliland, people talk about it as something that was once very important and can be reinvigorated because it legally held status as a state. It had recognition from 34 UN members before it voluntarily united 5 days later with the Republic of Somalia. By most accounts, the union was pretty quickly regretted by those in the northwest of the country. And by 1969, you had a military dictatorship, or a military officer, General Siad Barre, overthrow the civilian government. And this began sort of 30 years, just over 30 years of military dictatorship, which all went particularly badly in the northwestern corner of the country, where the Asak clan that formed the majority of residents there experienced increasingly brutal treatment at the hands of the regime, which culminated in a bombing campaign in 1998 that's remembered pretty widely by Somalilanders as having been a genocide. So, of course, brutality was never something that prevented a dictator from receiving largesse from either side during the Cold War. But by the time the government of Siad Barre collapsed in early 1991, Somalia had become the largest per capita recipient of aid in Africa. I mean, that's excluding the tiny little states like Gambia or Djibouti, but in the main, it had become the largest per capita recipient of aid in Africa, which is a pretty, there's some pretty steep competition for that, as you might imagine. And it had held this position since Siad Barre swapped sides in the Cold War. He was initially affiliated with the Soviet Union, but then in 1978, for a series of reasons I won't get into, they swapped sides to the US. And it's really then that the extraordinary levels of Western economic and military aid start flooding into the country, propping up the government in the 1980s. Barre was finally ousted in 91, and by May of that year, Somaliland declared its independence, which, as I said, has never been formally recognized by any other state. Now, as the war waged on in the South in the early 90s, which is quite famous, this is a story that many people already know and that has been sort of immortalized, at least to a Western audience of my kind of vintage, you know, through the movie Black Hawk Down. The level of violence that was going on in the North that we don't really hear that much about was actually probably even worse. So it was by no means a foregone conclusion that Somaliland's claim of independence was going to put it in any better position than the rest of Somalia. So I'm sure we'll get into this in a little while, but just to foreshadow here that Somaliland's wars in the 1990s, 91 to 96 to be precise, were ended largely, I mean, obviously it's more complex than this, but just let me put it broadly here and then we can drill down. It was ended largely by, I think, two headline processes. One of them was the large clan-based conferences that occurred over quite a number of years, and that brought huge numbers of delegates together to negotiate a settlement. And this happened in fits and starts, and it was disrupted by conflict and then it would restart. The other one was President Egal's use of loans from the country's wealthiest merchants to buy back arms from the warring clan-based militias, and then ultimately reintegrate these mobilized members back into a nascent national army.
So, Sarah, before we move on to, or sorry, move on to more detail on how Somaliland reached peace, can we explore a little bit more about Somalia and how it has just fallen apart? You know, why has it disintegrated into war, and why has it proven so impossible for the international community to bring this to an end?
Well, I think that the most significant difference between Somalia and Somaliland, and the one that I really draw out in the book, and it's just obvious from its title, is the nature of the international presence in both places. So at the moment we've had 18, or it's possibly more now, I lose count, at least 18 international conferences that have tried to bring peace to Somalia. And these have tended to be pretty hasty affairs. They're usually a few days, sometimes up to a week or slightly more, but they're quick, right? And Somalis tend to be pretty poorly represented to them compared to the number of delegates that go from other countries. As I said before, this was not the case for Somaliland, but I'm going to get into that a little more later. Let's focus here on Somalia. In the 1990s, there was about $4 billion that the US and the UN put into the country in trying to stabilize and end the war there. What this did, though, was it contributed to a very profound conflict economies. So you had international food agencies actually becoming parties to the conflict because they were paying belligerents for either protection or for humanitarian access. And in doing this, they provided, and this is a pretty common story, right? But in doing this, they provided pretty extraordinary opportunities for extortion. And they really established food aid as an alternative currency, as Aisha Ahmed puts it. And so this really lays the cornerstone for a very pervasive conflict economy. To the point
did the food aid also undermine the local agricultural economy?
Absolutely. And this is one of the most the biggest complaints that you will hear from, or it's one of the many, but it's certainly a headline complaint that you hear from groups like Al-Shabaab, that they viscerally hate the WFP because it is seen that they were dumping food aid into Somalia at times when Somalia's agricultural production and sales should have been the highest. So it all contributes to this sense that not only is it entrenching a conflict economy, but it's also undermining the ability of Somalis to produce their own food and sustain an agricultural industry. So this point of differentiation around external assistance packages is just so deeply scored into Somaliland's discourse about how its peace process succeeded where Somalia's failed. So if we sit then under this broad differentiation about the international presence and the conflict economies that it helped to entrench, I think there's a few specific things that international actors got pretty wrong in the very early days. And the first one was they really profoundly misunderstood clan structures. And by misunderstanding them, they helped to almost reconstruct them, redraw them by sort of breathing life into a newly imagined version of what a clan really was. So Somalia's clan structures, and this goes for both Somalia and Somaliland, I mean, it was, the system remains the same. They're often understood as being pretty rigid and unchanging, whereas actually they're quite flexible. I mean, they can be extremely flexible. And this was a point that gets lost on most international interveners, particularly the UN in the 1980s. And what they did as well was they tended to concentrate resources in the major cities. And this is something that happens all the time. Like major cities are easier to access, particularly for foreigners. The transport links are better. The general resources are better. And so what that does though is it provides an incentive for clan elders to relocate out of their local areas. And what this does is it alters the connection between the elders and the local communities that they were claiming to represent. And Peter Little, who's a great researcher who's done a fair bit of work on this, he talks about the way that terms like indigenous, clan, traditional, all become increasingly used by Somalis in their written statements because they understand that this is language that resonates well with external actors and external actors who want to be seen to be engaging with leaders who they believe are powerful and locally legitimate. So what you get is that as the international presence in southern Somalia increases, you have international agencies adopting this clan idiom. And so they start to receive proposals from so-called elders, even though some of these were really just disguised militia heads. And Peter Little did a fair bit of research on this. And he said that in 1994, he counted more than 28 separate clan and sub-clan identities in an area where just 10 years earlier, or no, I think 7 years earlier, he'd identified less than 10. So you see this burgeoning of clan, proclaimed clan identity. And this was something that I heard even in 2012 when I was in Somaliland and talking to people who had just been involved in an international conference in Istanbul. And this person told me that people, really quickly saw what was going on, that they were expected to be tribal elders. And so they don the hats of tribal elders because that's the language that they realized that the donors are using. Another point just about that difference between North and South, or Somaliland and the rest of Somalia, is that the UN had this really striking preoccupation, particularly throughout the 90s, but you could say that it's also continuing. They don't recognize Somaliland as an independent entity. A really striking preoccupation with maintaining a unitary state with Mogadishu as the capital. And actually, as Somalilanders were struggling at the most to bring the violence in the north under control, UNISOM 2, which was the United Nations mission in Somalia, actually played actors who involved in this peace process against one another, basically in an attempt to try to bring all peacemaking efforts back to Mogadishu and under UN auspices. So UNISOM starts financially supporting spoilers to go in and build support for a federal system of government in Mogadishu by sponsoring these smaller fringe conferences And in doing so, they endangered the larger and much more inclusive peace processes that were underway at the same time. And people have said that this is widely believed to have exacerbated the violence in the north, by which I mean Somaliland in the 90s.
Now, in Somalia, the UN has really sort of subcontracted, if that's the right term, the external security assistance to Somalia to the African Union, and the forces now, the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM. Now it's sort of a very much more regionally based force rather than, you know, from completely out of the region. Is it a more nuanced approach, or are they just making the same mistakes as we did 20, 30 years ago?
It is a more nuanced approach, that's fair to say, but at the same time, there is still the Somaliland hasn't been recognized, that's one, and so there is still this desire to deal with it as being one country, which creates all sorts of problems on the ground because the Somaliland governing authorities refuse to accept that. But also there is just this, I mean, fatigue isn't even a strong enough word, there is just a sense of despair that Somalia is still experiencing so much intervention from outside, and that constrains what they're able to do locally, politically as well.
I mean, Somalia, of course, has had, you know, a number of serious problems. One of which is it's been the home for quite a long time, until recently, of piracy off the Horn of Africa. Now, from my background, criminality, of which piracy is part, generally tends to occur in what, you know, we used to call ungoverned space, you know, rather like the tri-border area in South America between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, where lots of organized crime groups because there's no governed space. Is this actually what happened in Somalia, that piracy was just a response to, you know, inability to govern the area, or actually is there something more profound going on, or was there something more profound going on?
So that's an interesting question. What we found in Somalia, in one instance, is that the areas of Puntland, which is sort of it neighbours Somaliland, it's sort of up the north of Mogadishu, that's where you had most of the piracy occurring. And actually the level of governance was a bit better there than it was in southern Somalia, because lo and behold, pirates, rather like terrorists, find that it's actually pretty difficult to operate when there is absolutely no sort of political control. So having not a completely ungoverned space is actually more beneficial for criminal entities like pirates to operate. You need some level of control. But as to whether this was a solely local Somali specific problem, no. Piracy in Somalia initially emerged, at least partly, out of the marginalization of Somalia in the global community. So there's a long history to it, which I obviously don't have too much time to get into now, but part of the initial justification that was used by people who were boarding ships and calling for ransoms was initially that they were protecting Somali's international waters from illegal fishing by the international communities that the international community was doing nothing about, and also against illegal toxic waste dumping. So when the tsunami hit in Christmas of 2004, you just had a tremendous amount of toxic waste, even nuclear waste, coming up onto the shores of Somalia, which just proved what everybody knew, that these were areas that were being abused and preyed upon by other states. And so there was this narrative about the need for a Somali Coast Guard to be formed to protect the local fishing industry and also protect from dumping. And around about the turn of the century, you had a British private military contractor, Hart Security, go in and train a heap of Somali fishermen in Puntland to do things to help to ward off the international predation. So they trained them in things like locating vessels at sea using the internet, operating satellite phones, GPS equipment, boarding moving ships, all these skills that are actually extremely useful for...
All Coast Guard skills.
Coast Guard skills, but
Yeah.
when this company went out of business and left Somalia, all of a sudden these people lost their jobs, and many of them went on to become some of the most famous pirates.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing which, of course, dominates the Somalia security scene, and indeed the rest of East Africa, as an expanding problem in East Africa, is the growth of radical Islam and the group Al-Shabaab. And yet Somaliland seems to be immune to the rest of the region, to Al-Shabaab violence. Why is this?
Well, Somaliland did have a few attacks by Shabab. There was one against the UN compound in 2008, and then there was an attack in 2013 that was uncovered like in the final hours of preparation. So they do have a presence, but yeah, you're right. They haven't done any of their big attacks there, and there's a lot of controversy about this point. It's, at least there was when I was there, sort of around 2012, 2015, people asking the question, well, why is that? Why have they been seemingly immune from attacks? And one of the theories that was doing the rounds was that there might be some sort of tacit agreement between members of the Somaliland elite and members of Shabab. Now, that was obviously a very controversial point that many members of the government staunchly denied, of course. The other argument that got raised a lot, and I think that has gained more traction, is that, well, it's actually harder to operate in Somaliland because of the level of community responsiveness to issues like terrorism and piracy, that people in Somaliland want international recognition so much that they don't want to do things that would perceive them to be bad international citizens. And so there's a strong desire on the part of the community to report this sort of behavior and to stamp it out locally. So there's very differing opinions on that.
Interesting. So let's look now at how Somaliland found peace, if you like. Now, many of the things that commentators, or some commentators, ascribe to being as contributing to the Somali conflict, the clan structure and some intrinsically violent aspect to the Somali nature, supposedly, are also present, of course, in Somaliland. And yet Somaliland managed to end its war and find peace. How did that happen?
Again, I think the cleanest point of comparison between the two places is the nature and the degree of international intervention that both experienced. And the fact that Somaliland was very unusually detached from international power structures. So I'm not just talking about aid, even though that's the title of the book, because otherwise the title would have been too long. But I'm talking about international money. So they didn't have access to international loans from the IMF, which meant that they had no debt that needed to be serviced, but also they had no access to legal international weapons trade, which has a big impact on a government's capacity to wage violence, on the capacity of militias to be formed. But I think also, probably most importantly, there was no party that was trying to either end or benefit from Somaliland's wars. And that's actually extremely unusual in the contemporary era, to not have external parties who are trying, whether tacitly or overtly, to benefit from a war. Because Somaliland wasn't recognized, it wasn't seen as a particularly consequential part of the world. Geostrategic concerns looked pretty different 30 years ago to how they look now. It's a very different story now, and it's in a very politically and economically pivotal part of the world. But that wasn't so much the case 30 years ago. And the lack of international involvement, which again stemmed largely from this lack of international interest, frankly, meant that unlike the places that get targeted by international peace building, international state building interventions, the process that unfolded in Somaliland to end the violence evolved without any explicit expectations of how it should look. There were no schedules that needed to be met, and there was no technical indicators of success. The clan conferences that I've referred to before, they took as long as they needed to take. Sometimes this meant they took many months, and there was lots of starts and stops. There's one great story of the beginning of the conference in Bodoma, which is probably the most important one in 1993, being delayed for quite some time because of political wrangling between some of the key elites. And so there was a week dedicated to just Quran recitations. Like, you can never imagine that happening in something that is being overseen, presided over by the UN or others in the international community. And you also had, the chair people to the conferences. They would fall ill in order to allow time and political space for people to come together outside of the formal space of the conferences. Mm. But another.
So they had their own, they would set their own pace in negotiations, but also, and crucially, as you made the point, there's no external cash to be made by continuing the war. And so much of the energy that goes into conflict, which is all about money, a lot of it is about money, just simply was absent.
Yeah, and the peace process was also locally funded as well. So there was, one of the conferences took about 5 months. There was 2,000 delegates, and it was hosted by the Gadabursi clan. And everyone there knew, hey, this was an extraordinary expense that they were putting into this process, but they knew that reciprocity was somewhere down the line going to be expected. So don't waste time. This is local resources going into a local process. Now, I mentioned that there was about $4 billion that was poured into the southern parts of Somalia by the US and the UN in the 90s. Other than about $100,000, there was nothing that went into Somaliland's peace conference. And one thing that I find fascinating about this is that even the mention of the $100,000 is something that raises controversy within Somaliland. I gave a public talk there in 2015, and there was quite a few people there who'd read a previous piece that I'd written, which mentions this figure of $100,000. And a number of people were really pushing me on it, like, where did you get this figure about? We don't think that there was anything. There was nothing, because it's such an important part of the national narrative of their independence that they did this with no aid. Amusingly, the person who actually delivered the $100,000 from the donors happened to be in the audience as well. But just the idea that even $100,000 was a point of controversy, that because it upset this narrative of independence, was really fascinating to me.
I mean, there are obviously some cases where actually international assistance or external influence and assistance has helped to end conflicts. I'm thinking now, for example, in Northern Ireland, the personal intervention by Bill Clinton was absolutely critical in bringing people together. But this is a really interesting case where actually the absence of international intervention was critical in terms of ending the war. But it's one thing to find peace, quite another to sustain it, as Somaliland has done now for some 25 years, I think. How has it achieved that, especially given the fragility of the state's institutions, such as police and judiciary, etc.?
That's a great question. And this is where I think I really deviate from the mainstream literature on Somaliland and also on peace building more generally, because this tends to credit either the state apparatus that gets formed in Somaliland for being able to perform this maintenance of political order, or it's credited to the clan, or it gets credited to what's referred to as Somaliland's hybrid system, which is probably best understood as like this fruitful combination of the clan and formal organizations. What I think is really doing this work, though, was a deeper understanding of their own precarity and the ease with which their situation could become like Mogadishu's again. And so in a sense, I think the ability to sustain peace has not been so much despite the fragility of its institutions, but actually in many ways because of them, because of the fragility of their institutions. And we could look at the 2003 presidential elections as an example of this. There was initially a difference between the two candidates of just 80 votes out of 500,000 that were cast. So as you can imagine, this was really tense, and many people were expecting that there could be a violent outcome. The rhetoric from both sides of the election turned to being very much about not following Mogadishu and seeing that if they did choose to mobilize for violence, that's where it could end. So you've got this example of Mogadishu being used in a very real and tangible way to stave off the possibility of violence in Somaliland. And of course it did pass peacefully. So what I take from this is that the ability of state or formal institutions to sustain the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which is of course the standard definition of a state, but it's also the standard understanding of the way that political order is sustained, it's just not true in the case of Somaliland. And I think you could actually argue, and I do argue, that it's the weakness of its institutions that gets used kind of quite counterintuitively as a reason to sustain the peace.
I think your comments on the lack of monopoly of force that you made in your book, one of the many insights, which by the way I thoroughly enjoyed, I think was one of the most, something that was really interesting to me. And can you have any examples of how it actually works? How does policing justice actually work?
So I can give you a really interesting example of a case that took place when I was there in 2012, a conflict that the government got involved in, but not in the way that anyone in you or my background would expect them to do. So there was a case when someone was killed by a member of a clan, and the clan elders, the perpetrator, the killer's clan elders didn't try to, or didn't succeed, I'm not sure, in capturing the suspect. Okay, now that's a customary requirement for interclan negotiations to start. So this creates a deadlock, and people were expecting that a revenge killing by the victim's clan was probably on the cards. It's here that the Minister of Internal Affairs steps in, and he steps in to try and break the deadlock, and he issues an ultimatum to the offender's clan to either capture the offender, capture the murderer, so that investigations can take place, or negotiations rather, or they're all going to be arrested. At no time, though, did the minister actually suggest that the government forces would attempt to intervene in order to investigate or arrest the suspect. The suspect was free, and he wasn't recaptured, and so the minister carried good on the ultimatum and briefly arrests the elders from his clan. Once they were released, the minister then explains that what he had done in order to persuade the victim's clan members to delay their revenge, and to convince the elders from the murderer's clan that it was up to them to prosecute the crime. So what we see is that the government authorities in this story, they have played a mediating role, but they're using their coercive capacity to detain the elders and kind of, twist their arms into negotiating a solution that is actually going on outside of the government's judicial institutions. They are not trying to divert the dispute into its own jurisdiction. They're completely fine with it happening elsewhere. And I think that this reveals that the government hasn't established a monopoly on the legitimate use of force that I think a lot of people presume it to, and they sort of hold up as being the reason that Somaliland has been able to sustain its peace. But I think it also shows that it's not necessarily actively seeking that either.
How important, so just moving on a little, how important is the idea that what they call the independence discourse, they're continually seeking of independence to their maintenance of peace?
That's a controversial issue. Some people in Somaliland were quite open and said, look, the lack of independence has been a blessing in disguise. Others completely disagree with that, I hasten to add, but some see it as this really awkward dilemma or even paradox that it has been the lack of independence that has helped them to sustain peace, and that if they get independence, then there will be a lot more international intervention or international money, international access flowing in, and that could upset the apple cart. But that is a matter of huge debate within Somaliland. But the idea that Somaliland was able to negotiate and maintain its peace in considerable part because of its independence, not only from Somalia, but also from the international community, is a really powerful one. Even though it's really important to point out the idea that it actually doesn't have any money flowing in from the international community now is not true. There's UN trucks all over the place. There's lots and lots of foreign money flowing in there. But for the first 10 years, that really wasn't the case.
And so it's become part of their national narrative.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to move now on to sort of really our last question. As you've explained, Somaliland's peace is largely born out of a reaction to its own war, and to justify its claims to independence, by showing it's peaceful and different to Mogadishu and the rest of Somalia. It engaged its own social structures and traditions to build the mechanisms for peace. It was left to do that by the international community, and the very weakness of its formal state institutions helps to sustain the peace. Now, at face value, to me, these look like a very specific recipe for peace that wouldn't necessarily be immediately transferable elsewhere. So how can the lessons of Somaliland be more broadly applicable?
Good one. So first, I think the fact that Somaliland was so unusually detached from the international system in just about every way during its first formational years, that is, like, it's about its first 10 or so, and the years of its peace process, I think really highlights just how possible autonomous development, autonomous peace building really is. And this is something that international discourses about security and about development just profoundly ignore. There's almost always this assumption that external involvement in processes of peace or state building are invariably useful. You've just got to tinker with them to make them a bit better, but they're always useful. And I don't think that this is necessarily true. And I talk a lot to Yemenis. That's another area that I cover a lot. And one of the things that I'm hearing a lot now is the frustrated view that if they were left to their own devices, they'd actually be quite capable of negotiating a workable settlement to the conflict. Like, we can get into that later, but it's a very, very strongly felt sentiment. But going deeper, I think that the hope of finding directly applicable lessons that can be transported between cases, and we see this a lot. Like, I'm often asked about, what are the lessons that we can take from Somaliland and apply elsewhere. I think that in one way, it kind of reveals this desire within the scholarly and practitioner community to find specific social outcomes that can be engineered, but this often doesn't work very well. We tend to be fairly bad at social engineering. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that we look instead at the much bigger picture lessons that Somaliland's experience does contain. One of the most obvious of which is that local context, local agency, local identity is invariably part of any political process, right? The social world is never linear, and despite this, development models, state building models are very linear. But I think that's it's a bit of a dissatisfying answer, that context matters, so we've got to let context happen. It doesn't really tell us that much that is directly transferable, other than there's probably going to be unintended consequences. But for a long time, when I was first starting to write the book, I basically thought that that was where the book story was going to end, that external intervention inhibits contextually important people and contextually important processes from emerging, and that the overriding presumption that international intervention is a valuable contribution is limiting to development processes. Now, that's a thread that runs through the book, but then I realized that there was something that had been staring me in the face throughout all the field work that I did. And that was that this is, I think, a story about a lot more than just the importance of allowing local context to determine the development process. And I think that what Somaliland's experience helps us to see is that many of the things that development and security scholars and practitioners have so long presumed about the way that peace and order emerges and endures are actually fundamentally wrong. The usual assumption, I think, is that political order increases, that's basically in lockstep with the increases that are made to the capacity of either state or state-like institutions. But what Somaliland shows us is that this presumption can actually be flipped on its head. And if it can be flipped on its head, and it can be, I think, because the precarity of its institutions also underpin its political order, then we were never looking at a causal relationship to begin with. So my claim here is that political order is never actually a simple function of either state or state-like institutional capacity, but it's far more, it's about the far more slippery discourses that give these institutions life. And so this suggestion really challenges the common sense causal relationship between institutions and order. Because if either the strength of an institution or the weakness of an institution can provide a foundation of order, then there was never really a causal relationship between them. It's correlative perhaps, but it's not causal. And this has really important implications beyond Somaliland, because if weak institutions can also support order under certain conditions, in this case discursive conditions, then we see just how inherently fluid this relationship is. And this shows us as well just how susceptible to rapid change our institutions are. And I think that this is the point that I would really like people to take away from all this, and that I'll end on, is that the institutions and states that we in the West tend to label as being fragile are actually a lot closer to our own robust, effective, constraining, whatever you want to call them, institutions than we like to imagine. And it's when the norms and the discourses that give these institutions legitimacy deteriorate, as I think we're seeing happen across the world now, things can change very quickly, because we were never actually dealing with a simple causal relationship that we thought that we were. The relationship is always mediated by ideas and the ways that people express these ideas in language and practice, and language and ideas change really fast. So I think that we do well to understand them as the real foundation for peace and political order.
I enjoyed your analysis about how the very presence of the international community and everything that it brings with it in local politics substantially changes the local political scene, and indeed can undermine the legitimacy of what are perceived as traditionally as being legitimate leaders and orders. And that's something that we simply don't understand, about how we impact. And the other aspect about aid, which I reflect from my West African experience, that came out of your book, was that since most aid is channeled through government, local governments, it makes taking ownership of that government really rewarding, which is the reason why we had so many coups and continue to do so in some African countries, because there is money to be made out of it. And absent that aid, there just wasn't that incentive to try and overthrow government in Somaliland. And I think that's a really, really interesting insight. Is there anything you'd like to add, or before we throw open to Q&A?
Look, I think that was very comprehensive. Thank you. Let's open it up to questions from.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, Alistair, over to you.
We've got some great questions coming in. We'll get through as many as we can. I'm going to just take sort of two together to kick off. If a lack of international aid had helped Somaliland, can a lack of international recognition damage its peace and progress? So leading from that, what are the prospects for Somaliland obtaining international recognition? And does Eritrea's separation from Ethiopia provide a relevant precedent?
What are the prospects of it gaining international recognition? Look, if the recognition of Eritrea and the recognition of South Sudan was greeted with great fanfare within Somaliland, because it was seen as being, look, this is Pandora's box being opened, we can start to recognize secessionist entities. The difference between those cases, though, was that the secession was signed off in the capital, whereas Somalia will not sign off on secession with Somaliland. There has been no indication that they will do that. So I think that would require then the international community leading on taking it through the UN, which I just don't see happening. There was a question as well about what recognition might mean for Somaliland. a really hotly debated question. I mean, the obvious answer is that people would be thrilled, because this is very much what their entire international posturing and discourse is about. But I think I certainly picked up very clear concerns about what would happen. And part of the tension within the discourse is that it does recognize that, you know, we did this by our own hand. We negotiated our peace under a tree while Somalis did it in a 5-star hotel in Nairobi. Many people realize that that is likely to be upset if and when international recognition was to come. So there is a sense of trepidation, I think, as well. But of course, that can get, there is also great enthusiasm just for the idea of recognition. But I often wonder if it became more likely to be a reality, how people would feel about that.
Absolutely. You'd mentioned Yemen, and an obvious question is, which has been upvoted, how has the war in Yemen affected Somaliland?
Well, in many ways, principally that just the strategic nature of the region has just been amplified. I mean, it has been increasing for quite some time, particularly with the Chinese involvement and Belt and Road, the Emirates wanting anyway to expand their presence in ports across the region, but also in the possibility of Somaliland being providing military bases for the war in Yemen. So it's just amplified the sense that this is a strategically important area. There's also been a lot of flow of refugees between the two, which was always the case, but it was previously in the opposite direction. But now you're having Yemenis going over to Somalia more than was ever the case before.
But based on your research in the region, what would you say are the necessary conditions that the international community should consider before contemplating whether or not to support the potential division of an existing state?
Look, I think you've got to base it on what the local population wants. And I think that is part of the reason, that is the reason mainly why the international community is unwilling to lead this. They want it, you know, if it was to be led by Mogadishu and Hargeisa, then that would be a different story. And that is what happened in the two previous cases that I referred to before. But I think that nobody has the appetite or the interest to lead a process like this. So I think until there is settlement between the two capitals, little will change.
And certainly when sorry, just to intrude, when I was working in Mogadishu, there was absolutely convinced that the Somalilanders, if I can call them that, were Somalis.
Oh, yes.
And it's just something they wouldn't even consider. Yep. I think I'm right in saying that.
Absolutely, yeah. No, people, yes, it is considered treason by many Somalis, the idea that they are calling for their own state. Yeah, it's not something that I can ever imagine Mogadishu saying yes to.
Yeah. I'd read one comment that women had played a particular role in solving some of the problems there. Could you just briefly talk a little bit more about that and how that came about?
An extremely important role, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to go into it previously, but look, women weren't formally involved in most of the negotiations. In fact, they were cut out, but what they did do is, like women so often do, is much of the heavy lifting behind the scenes. So they were involved in basically cajoling the men to take part in the negotiations, and some of them have told me how, you know, we stopped cooking, we stopped taking care of the kids until they said that they would go back and negotiate in good faith. And so women have a really interesting structural role in clan-based societies like Somalia's, in that when a woman gets married, she does not lose the clan of her birth. So she becomes a member of her husband's clan, but she doesn't lose the clan of her birth. So she's a member of two clans, whereas men are only a member of the clan of their birth, which means that they can perform, and I'm always a bit hesitant of giving such a structuralist answer, but so take this with something of a grain of salt, but women, because they maintain two clan identities, in times of conflict, they are the behind the scenes negotiators, because they can move between the various clans, and it's just a normal thing. And they are very much involved in trying to bring the warring parties together. And their contribution rather was extraordinary, and is increasingly being credited more as being so.
That's really interesting, good to pick out. So if local social processes and structure is so paramount, do you see a role for external actors in peace building?
To an extent, yes, but I think that the most useful thing that they can probably do, and I guess I'm thinking this very much with my eyes on Yemen, which is my other real interest, is that they can provide political space. You know, they can provide the ability for people to come together without so much pressure, I think, and sort of hold back the tide of other international actors that might want to be involved, and sort of really try to protect a level of political space for local negotiations to occur. But they need to accept that this is a really bumpy process. It happens in fits and starts over long periods of time, but that time needs to be protected. And I think that's a role that they can usefully play, but that's typically not what they do. They go much, much further than that.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, if I could just also add, there obviously have been cases where conflicts have been brought to a close with international assistance. There's obviously, as you said earlier, no silver bullet, no lesson that is absolutely specific. In Sierra Leone, for example, the war wouldn't have ended without Nigeria's assistance, nor indeed in the end with the United Nations bringing the two sides together to oversee the disarmament process. I don't think that the local Sierra Leoneans will be able to do that by themselves. I don't think. So there are obviously times when external assistance might be necessary, and other times when it will be really unhelpful. Would you agree with that as a generalization, Sarah, or do you think I've gone too far?
Look, cautiously, yes, but I think what gets us into a lot of trouble is, and I'm not talking about you, I'm saying more generally, the presumption that international assistance will be of use. And so now we start our peace building process, and this gets driven by this, by this entity or the UN or whatever. And I think that is profoundly damaging. And I think it often happens way too soon, before there has been sort of a chance for local actors to really come together with something on the line, with something serious on the line. So I don't want to say that it is never useful. I mean, there are no silver bullets and there are no cookie cutter answers. Neither saying never any assistance or always assistance is obviously going to answer this, but allowing space for the political and contextual complexities to sort of work their way, I think, is really, really important. And the international community, for all sorts of structural reasons, has real difficulties in being able to see that through. The way that the UN and other INGOs and foreign ministries and aid agencies are structured, you're there for a year, you're there for 2 years, you tick off things on your, to advance your career. You are not rewarded for being in one place for a long period of time and really getting to know it. You are rewarded for being a generalist. So that tends to mean that people from the international side lack the level of contextual detail about a specific case. So it's all these sorts of things that can lead into it. But no, I'm not saying that there is one completely right or one completely wrong answer. And there can be a role for external assistance, sometimes in bringing people together.
Just following on briefly, Sarah, from your comment on women and how that works with the clans. Are the clans in Somaliland much different to those in Puntland, for example, or other parts of Somalia?
Yeah, look, sometimes people will argue that the reason that Somaliland has had peace is because they're all from the majority Isak. The majority is from one clan, and that's something of a factor. But then keep in mind that throughout the 90s, it was the Isak subclans that were engaged in just a terrible, terrible violence. So the idea that they all came together because they were Isak just, I think, doesn't hold historical. The historical evidence doesn't show it, but so yeah, there is a dominant clan within Somaliland, but structurally, no, very, very similar.
Do you have a feeling for what role the international diaspora is playing in promoting economic growth, and how much influx is there back from overseas to Somaliland?
the majority of people's incomes come from the diaspora. Like that is how money largely comes into the country. People are sending remittances there's no definitive estimation of what that is, but it seems like it's probably at least, let's say, between 500 and 1,000% of what the government's annual budget would be. It's huge. I mean, that is how many Somalilanders and Somalis and Africans and Middle Eastern, it's very common, but this is how many of them have their livelihoods.
And is international tourism playing any sort of role there?
International tourism?
Yeah.
It's tiny, but it is. There are certainly people who go there for tourism, but it's a small part of their economy. They would like it to grow, and it's great. You should go.
Absolutely. Well, just coming back to the clan conferences, because there's quite a lot of interest in this. Did any natural leader emerge out of that? Because the situation in a difference drawn with Lebanon, for example, where there are people tribal clan differences that there's no leader right yet. But was that the case in Somaliland? There were natural leaders coming out of this?
Yes, and also there was the second President Egal, was a capable leader, and he was very good at getting money out of the wealthy merchants and at using that to reasonably developmental ends. So that is a difference. They also had a group of people who were reasonably well educated from one particular secondary school, and the alumni from this institution go on to form the majority, or let's say about a third of every cabinet that Somaliland has ever had. Like, they're very, very influential and active within the bureaucracy.
And just to come out to what is the main economy there in Somaliland? You may have covered it, but a couple of questions as to...
It's livestock is the main one, but then there's lots of people circling around looking for oil, because it's believed that there are large oil deposits both within the country, but also mainly off the coast. And so if that happens, if there are large oil deposits discovered, I think all bets are off. Everything changes if they are proven and they are extractable.
Yeah. You talked, or Richard had raised the question about piracy, and obviously some incredible seamanship among the people there to go do what they were doing, albeit nefarious. So has the Coast Guard come back in any shape or form as a source of employment for them?
No, not really. And even in Somaliland, where there was very limited incidents of piracy, it did happen on a number of occasions, but it was very limited. They don't have, or at least when I was doing my last interviews around this a few years ago, they didn't have a functioning Coast Guard. It was basically the Coast Guard didn't have boats, or they had tiny, tiny little boats. They relied on reports from members of the community, hey, I think this guy's organizing something, do something. It wasn't a matter of them patrolling out at sea. Absolutely.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Maybe we can squeeze in a couple of brief last question. But the situation in Ethiopia, some of the unrest there, is that having an impact across the border?
Well, yes. I mean, they share a border, so that is affecting some of the crossovers there. But I couldn't give you any more details than that. It's something that's a little bit out of my area at the moment.
Sure. No problem. Maybe we can get one last question, and apologies to anyone if we can't get yours in, but we've covered a lot. But just on the whole sort of peace process, what was there any type of formal truth and reconciliation structure going on there, or was it coming from the clans?
No, not really. I mean, it was a very open and inclusive process at the clan conferences, and they explicitly made a promise that they weren't going to go after people who had done them wrong during the conflict. There's a Somali term, hale dale, which I may be mispronouncing, that is basically saying that there will be, if the losses from war are so incalculable, so huge that they can't be calculated and that there cannot be reciprocity, you've just got to move on.
All right. Well, thank you. That brings us to our 6 o'clock close, and we'll try and sort of stick to our times, but thank you, Sarah, very much, and Richard, indeed, for another fantastic in-conversation. Thank you to everyone watching for your interest and your participation with some really great questions. So from us here in lockdown in Victoria, if you're outside, please stay safe and well, and thank you for your interest. We'll see you again. So thanks again very much, Richard and Sarah, and we'll be in touch. And so I'll send out the link to the discount flyer for the book. Please buy a copy.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for hosting me, and thanks for great questions, Richard.
Thank you.
Good luck to everyone in Victoria.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.